Guidepost Solutions issued a sexual abuse investigative report to the Southern Baptist Convention on April 22nd, and they made some common sense recommendations, while other recommendations may lead to disaster. The Sexual Abuse Task Force has made even more proposals. Unfortunately, Southern Baptist messengers have very little time to make sense of the proposals before being asked to make serious decisions about the SBC's future. The pressure to adopt at least some of the report's recommendations will be enormous on the day of the convention. Will there be significant time allotted for thoughtful deliberation? Will messengers know what questions to ask to start us on a course that is both just and effective? Joining me today is attorney Jon Whitehead from Kansas City, Missouri, to discuss the impact of this report on the present and the future of the SBC. Jonathan, many people, when they read the Sexual Abuse Task Force report from Guidepost, they looked at it and they felt like it was fairly narrow in who it covered, what it presented, as far as an investigation that went on for 7 or 8 months. How did you feel about that when you read it?
Yeah, so I think folks were probably surprised with both the motion, how it was presented. I remember Grant Gaines said the purpose of the motion was to get both sides of the story about the leaked Russell Moore letters. So it's supposed to be an investigation to all these claims about the convention-wide allegations that Dr. Moore had made when he left. But the motion that was actually made ended up being very narrow, and Guidepost itself interpreted its authority narrowly. So you'll recall now the motions just says we're just looking at the executive committee of the SBC and only through the date of the last convention. It was the 20 years prior. So anybody that's new on the executive committee doesn't get looked at, only if it happened in the past 20 years. It's a very narrow set of circumstances, despite being a broad set of allegations. What actually got made was an investigation into a particular group, the group that ran the executive committee over the past 20 years.
Well, and the one name that was kind of outed that I think surprised most everyone in the Southern Baptist Convention was Johnny Hunt. Not being aware there was any kind of issue there. Do you think that's significant that they revealed that one particular individual?
Yeah, so that was really interesting because it falls into the motion by virtue of that victim saying, well, I think I was groomed while Dr. Hunt was president of the SBC. And so that's the only reason that falls in. And so some folks have said, was that a surprise? Were they happy or glad to include that? Was that something that folks wanted to be included or not? But really, given that there are other things done by presidents during their administration, is certainly when J.D. Greer hired Brian Loritz, that was within his administration. So there were some things that were included and excluded. But Guidepost says we felt this allegation was strong enough and connected enough to the motion that we felt compelled to report it out. And so we end up with what really was a surprise to a lot of folks.
Do you think the Hunt revelation was somewhat of a signal to other top key leaders within the convention? It all seems like political football in a lot of ways. And this was supposed to be an outside third-party investigation. It was taken away from the executive committee's control. We removed the barrier that would be there because of attorney-client privilege, obviously, and that was removed. And then we had this Sexual Abuse Task Force that was supposed to be the intermediary. Does it appear to you as an attorney, when you're looking at it, does it appear to be some type of political football within the convention?
Well, certainly there's the risk of political football. Like I've said, you end up with this oddly narrow motion. You end up with the waiving of attorney-client privilege, which is kind of designed to kneecap an opponent in litigation in some ways. You end up with certain things being included and excluded, and you end up with recommendations and solutions that do seem to empower new folks and get rid of old folks. And so I know Krista Brown, who's an abuse advocate, said it sure seems to me like there's a power play inside. We're not sure how it all falls out, but it does look like there are warring factions inside the SBC that are trying to use the report to get rid of opponents, but also to protect friends. And so the real question for messengers is, are we going to see investigations and reports that are across the board at all entities? Is everyone going to live by new rules, or is it just a new group of friends? Like, that really is the concern. And so the Hunt allegation is surprising because it's the first sign of something that Johnny Hunt was associated or employed with, NAM, not at the executive committee, but it raises the point. There's lots more work to be done. There's lots more investigation to be done. And so if folks thought they could start this investigation and just target their old enemies over the past 20 years, that's not going to be the trick case. Having invited the whirlwind, there is a whirlwind that needs to happen. And the investigations need to go on, not just at the executive committee, but at other entities. And whether there was abuse or politics involved in that decision, that's something messengers need to know.
Yeah, it is. And that seems to me to be pretty hard to dig up. It's become an archaeological dig to find out kind of what's behind everything and what's motivating things. You use the word, whirlwind. Coming out of this report, it's only a few weeks old at this point, but it did come with recommendations, and there has been a response from survivors, a survivor joint list or recommendations that came back from a few. This basically has been pushed by a small survivor group and some advocates, which I understand. There's been a long battle with that. But of these recommendations, there are some pretty significant things that are being recommended that when I look at it, it seems like they could have a long-term detrimental impact on the Southern Baptist Convention if we don't take our time to make sure we evaluate all sides to this. What are the things that jumped out to you maybe about these recommendations and what may be short-sighted, I guess?
Yeah, well, I guess I'll start with saying I do think there have been lots of abuse victims in the SBC. So I don't want to leave the impression that it's just a couple of rabble-rousers that have had legitimate complaints about celebrity pastor culture and how that has been treated over the past 40 or 50 years. There is a sense, if you read the Bob Jones report or even the Guidepost report, that when it comes to criticizing God's man, the leaders, there is this fear that you can't touch them, can't criticize them. That's ungodly to criticize them. And so I know in my local church when I was growing up, my childhood church, it was embroiled in scandal about 20 years ago because the minister's son was on staff and fathered a child, and they handled it just terribly. Yeah. And so there has been a history of response to abuse in lots of places, lots of churches that I think has been handled wrong.
Right. Well, and in all fairness, just to your point, I think if you look at abuse per capita across the United States, that probably is going to reflect itself into churches that are in those, if you do go in and look at sex offender registry, and you look at a particular zip code and you find a higher rate there than in other places, right? Those churches that are ministering in that community are potentially going to have a higher rate of abuse. I mean, I think on a per capita basis, it's going to transfer over. But what we see in this report is obviously a narrow number of abuse victims and advocates that are pushing it, and the recommendations now that have come out of the task force. So what do you see is going to be an issue moving forward with some of these recommendations? Yeah,
so I think the question is, what does the convention, what problems does the convention want to solve? What do messengers see as their problem? And what's to be done about it? And then can we do something that's better than what's already out there that will really solve these problems? Or are we just stuck with window dressing? Is it just we wish we could do better, but we can't? And so when we look at the problems we can solve, if you look at the Houston Chronicle report, it says there are 700. They'd found 700 folks that were convicted of some kind of civil or criminal sexual offense over whatever number of years they'd looked at it. And then they focused on, out of that 700, there were approximately 35 that continued working at a church after they'd been convicted. And that might be a problem the convention can bring to bear, to say, look, if you're the kind of folks that are going to hire convicted sex offenders after they've been convicted, that's not kosher. But that's 35 out of what the Houston Chronicle says is a much bigger number. And certainly the list that the executive committee was keeping, that's a list of all convictions, not folks that were working at another church. So the Catholic,
that's out of over 47,000 churches.
Right,
obviously.
right.
Yeah.
So the Catholic problem was known abusers that get moved from church to church, whereas the Baptist problem, that seems to be relatively small. Now, if there's something we can do to fix that, great. And certainly there are things we might be able to do to fix that.
Well, but the SBC doesn't have authoritative control like the Catholic Church, which
right.
I've noticed in the media particularly. In fact, some of the media reports I've seen say the Southern Baptist Church, and then they go on to state the problem. Southern Baptist Church reported, Southern Baptist, just like you talk about the Catholic Church.
Right.
Our polity is totally different, which leads to the autonomy issue and all those issues. What can the SBC do to handle that? One of the things the report puts forth is this creation of an administrative entity. That seems to be a structural change in what we have as Southern Baptists that is going to create a systemic shift in what's being done, especially if that administrative entity begins to take on itself investigative powers, all those kind of things, because then that looks more like a denomination, not a convention of churches.
Right.
It's a looking over. How does that look legally as far as what happens in the convention?
Well, certainly there are some folks that would like to stick us in the Catholic box, right?
Sure.
No matter what we say, we operate like a big corporation, they say, and we're responsible like a big corporation. And so autonomy is just a sham, they think. And so their argument will always be, you're just like the Catholics, you're responsible just like the Catholics. And so we're going to tell a story that sounds an awful lot like what happened with Roman Catholic bishops not reporting childhood sex abuse. There are some terrible stories of that particular thing happening in the SBC. But when we look at the Houston Chronicle report, the big problem seems to be churches that don't talk to each other about passing, they've got suspicions, nothing illegal, or somebody says it's an affair, it's a he said, she said situation. And so that minister moves on down the road, and it takes 4 or 5 times before somebody can finally pin it on them. And so if that's the problem we're trying to solve, then that will look very different than an issue of widespread hiring convicted sex offenders after they've already been convicted. So a lot of the size of the administrative entity depends on what problem is the convention going to solve. Because frankly, solving the problem of has somebody been convicted, well, that you search online, you do a background check, and you say, has this person been convicted or not? That's a pretty small agency. An entity that's going to go out and do investigations or hire independent lawyers to go do investigations and manage litigation on top of litigation, that's going to be a much bigger entity. And so a lot of the issue becomes, what is the scope? The Survivors Fund, there's another one. What is the scope of that? Is that a $5 million fund, or is that a $100 million fund, a $200 million fund? Right. And I can see arguments both ways as to what that fund would need to be to fairly compensate, depending on what the convention decides is its responsibility.
Right. Well, let's go back to the administrative entities just a second, and then come back to the compensation fund, because those are tied together because of
Right.
the way it appears that this is set up. The administrative fund, I mean, not the administrative fund, the administrative entity,
Right.
once it's set up, if that moves forward the way it appears, I mean, there's obviously huge cost in creating a new entity, staffing it, all that other kind of thing, the constant monitoring, all that. But here's where I see to be kind of a problem. Comes back to the ascending and descending liability issues. And so if a local church or a pastor or an associational missions leader in a local association or a state convention leader feels it's their responsibility, hey, we have a suspicion about, then we send that up, quote unquote, up the chain to this administrative entity for them to investigate, them to explore. Then all of a sudden we are connecting ourselves. We are making that entity responsible for what's happening locally, where that's, I mean, we've never given authoritative control. We've never given that kind of thing to the Southern Baptist polity.
Yeah.
I mean, every group is autonomous in spite of what the ERLC and the North American Mission Board reported to the U.S. Fifth Circuit Court and the Supreme Court in saying we had a hierarchical, a structure and stuff. None of that's true, or historically has ever been true. But that administrative entity seems to be connecting, or would be connecting, that ascending and descending liability issue.
Yeah, I certainly the question of who's responsible for what happens in local churches, the convention needs to understand what it's being asked to accept responsibility for. As I've told somebody, it's a nice sentiment to say the Baptists are responsible for all the orphans in our county. That's a great sentiment until you have to do it, until that becomes a legally binding promise. And so we need to be careful that we can, when our yes is yes, when we say we're responsible for this issue in our local churches, the Southern Baptist Convention can do that if it wants.
Right.
But what would be terrible is if it makes promises it can't keep. If it says, well, we're happy to backstop survivors to the tune of $1 million a year, but it's $100 million a year problem, then the lawyers will say, you made that promise, we're going to hold you to it. So we need to be careful that when we make the promise, we know the cost and can budget for it appropriately. And I think that is one concern. The process that we're opening, I think there's concerns on both sides. One is, can we do it fairly? Can we do it in a way that honors biblical justice and biblical autonomy? And it seems to me that we've seen some criticism of that, the Guidepost recommendations. Guidepost recommended kind of some open-ended things. There was no abuse, no definition of sexual abuse. So it was not clear what would be included. It recommended that we would include allegations that were substantiated or credible. And there was no real question about what that meant, or no real definition of what that meant. And so I know Josh Abatoy over at American Reformer written a really good article talking about, well, based on Guidepost recommendations, here are some concerns about biblical justice and church autonomy in the door that's opened. I know since then, members of the SBC Task Force and some friends of theirs, lawyer friends of theirs, have said, well, we plan to implement some new additional procedural safeguards. Things like limiting the actual accusations to accusations of breaking the law, not just sexual misconduct. Well, that was kind of what we were concerned about, was the sexual misconduct that isn't quite illegal. They've also implemented, or at least have hinted, that they would impose a standard that says, well, we can't have he said, she said allegations. If it's just he said, she said, or he said, or she said, she said, if it's just one person accusing another, that doesn't go in the database. But then that seems like lots of the prominent stories we've heard of responding poorly to abuse, they won't go into this database. And so we have this odd situation where we have recommendations that both don't seem to solve anything and may not be biblical or just. Right? We're stuck on these horns. And so it does seem to me as a messenger, and I know time is short, and and folks need to get things done, and we only meet once a year, et cetera, et cetera. But as a messenger, I want to see the fleshed out system that both solves problems in a biblical way. And I'm concerned that what we have now is kind of a, well, here's some things we could do, and here's some solutions we might talk about in the future, but it doesn't seem to be well written out and gelled together. I'm not sure what victim. Now, imagine you're a victim.
Right.
One problem is I'm a pastor. I'm falsely accused. We'll make sure it's fair in there, that I can get a hearing and I can clear my name if I need to. Excellent point. And that's what lots of folks have said. What if I'm a victim? What if I'm, raped by the youth minister, or had an affair with the pastor, and now I'd like to report them into the SBC database? And so what the process that is laid out is that victim then has to go to the SBC, call the number and say, I've been abused. And the SBC says, was it illegal? Say, I don't know. Was it criminal? I don't know. Well, we're going to go hire an outside lawyer to do a review of your case, and you'll give him all the facts, and he'll decide whether or not it was legal or unlawful. And if the abuse victim has their own lawyer, why would you let an outside lawyer write a letter that might say this wasn't illegal? I don't understand. I from an abuse victim standpoint, somebody who's legitimately hurt and wants to be compensated correctly, this process seems like a nightmare in some ways, where I could come in with my allegation that I think I can prove to a jury or to the prosecutor, and some outside Baptist lawyer is going to say, well, we're not sure it's illegal yet, or it's just he said, she said, and we can't put it in our database.
Right. I'm
not sure why victims will go through that process any more than pastors will feel comfortable about a process where they could be falsely accused. So the implementation of what it is we're accepting responsibility for is really a key question. And I get the feeling that lawyers advising the task force have said, well, we can't take on all this litigation risk, which is the exact same story. The same problem we've had. We can't just take on accusations because that's litigation risk. We're hearing the same story. And so have we really changed? Have we really taken on a solution?
Right.
Or are we just, it's new people in the seats, and that's the solution we propose, is that, hey, at least they're new folks.
Well, but I think that is so critical that our messengers understand, the impact of what's done. Is it really going to accomplish long-term what needs to be done? Is it just going to create a feeling that, oh, well, we've done something?
Because for a small group of folks.
Right. For a very small group of folks, yeah. And not to diminish the pain that an abuse victim has at all. It's just looking at the long-term for sure. And, there's two things that come to mind. First, and I hate to keep coming back to the political football analogy, but I have seen people who have been hurt in ministry because of false accusation. And both in the local church, a pastor, where members are upset with him about something, and they work together and conspire together to try to get rid of him or defeat him in the business meeting or something else. Same thing has happened in association, state convention levels, and at a national level, where we've seen, hey, let's all get our story straight kind of thing behind the scenes. At least that's the way it appears. That would be one. But two is the Piranha effect. And I hate to say this because you are an attorney, but I have already seen it. Last night, I very quickly did a search on SBC abuse cases or something like that. I can't remember the exact phrase, but just one phrase that I searched, and I came up with over a dozen law firms who have already created web pages and landing pages that go into detail of how they're willing to represent you if you think you've been accused. You can get a free consultation, and I mean, it is the Piranha effect, man. Boy, they are out there already. And these were all just, these were advertisements. They're popping up on Facebook, they're popping up on Instagram, popping up on Twitter, and the convention hadn't even met yet. There hasn't been anything done, but there is a vulnerability already that is being shown from what is apparently there. And of course, I think the perception of the Southern Baptist Church is like the Catholic Church. A lot of people don't understand that, but it's creating an environment and going to create an environment that on your side, what you just said, that litigation is going to be incredible. And which brings us back to where you started or veered to a minute ago about this compensation fund. I don't know much about how they're thinking about doing that, but I do know this. I've had multiple pastors who have already said, I've seen it online, and I've had some say to me personally, our church is not going to continue to support the cooperative program if we find out that our cooperative program dollars are being ciphered off to help defend or pay abuse victims for some guy in some other church.
Yeah.
You know, I'm here in Tennessee, he's in New Mexico, I'm in New York, he's somewhere, you know, I mean, they're just not going to do it. And so I think there would be this kind of a quick spiral. It may be real quick, it may be slow, but it's going to be a kind of a death spiral where if they start moving in that direction, there are just going to be a lot of churches that are going to start saying, I'm just not going to do that. And either they'll redirect their funds directly to avoid that and just cut out the executive committee altogether, so their money's not ciphered off for that.
Right. Well, and so I'll go back and defend my brother lawyers. You know, those folks serve a purpose. They're there.
That's true.
They're there to represent their clients and get the most they can get for their clients. And in some ways, I respect that. They have a role to serve. But understand, those lawyers have now been, the reason they're active is that there's a report that says, well, you all were kind of like the Catholic Church. Right. And you need to accept responsibility. And so let's, you know, if the Southern Baptist Convention does want to accept responsibility for underfunded or undercapitalized churches for what goes on in its 47,000 churches, we could do that. We could vote to become responsible for what happened at 47,000 churches. We didn't budget for that. And so in some ways, as the lawyer, I'm just concerned the convention knows the promise it's going to make. If it wants to be like the Catholic Church in that regard, and because of its caring heart, wants to accept financial responsibility for what has happened in local churches over 20 or 30 or 40 years, it can do that, but it's going to be a big number. And so historically, what we've said is we cooperate. We're like a vendor. You know, you send us the money and we do a very specific thing, but none of us are complicit for the sins of what happens in other local churches. You have to do something pretty flagrant for us to say, we won't even cash your check. That's been the Baptist way for a long time. And that's enabled us to not be a denomination, but cooperate. If instead of that model, we want to change to say, no, we're also going to provide a backstop for local churches that didn't do the right thing, we could do that. And that's why lawyers are saying, we've got a report right here that says you're like the Catholic Church.
Right. Well, yeah. And they're advertising for class action lawsuits and the whole thing. But here, my question goes back to what we talked about a second ago about the autonomy, though. We've always been autonomous. Every individual church, every organization, every association, state convention, all of our entities they're operating autonomous, which has created quite a few problems over the years because, you know, if our trustee system's not working effectively, then those entities are not being managed effectively either, but they still are autonomous. And what you're saying, if the suggestion is followed through with saying, hey, yeah, we'll take responsibility. We feel bad about that. We have a tender heart for that. Then we literally are changing the polity that Southern Baptists have held to from the very, very beginning. Yeah.
Yeah. You don't want to do it accidentally. You do want to understand what it is you are saying. And I am worried that some language in the report and some actions that get taken to the convention floor instead of working through the process. Now it looks like the convention directs these entities from the floor. Oh yeah, you will. You're going to do X, Y, and Z. We're going to tell you what to do. And so, bylaw 26G or whatever it was that requires a referral back to the entities, that didn't get followed in some cases last year. And so I am worried that we unintentionally do operate or do support the story that we're not autonomous. we do have to observe our autonomy. So it is a decision point for messengers to insist, if we want to be autonomous, if we're making charitable offerings, not legal responsibilities, we do need to be very careful about the words we use and the structures we invent and the responses we make. We want to be sure, if we want to be in control of our decisions. At some point, it's not so much the class actions that weigh down an organization. It's just the number of lawsuits. You get so many claims, and there's not enough assets, and there's not enough insurance. And then in that case, the organization just throws up its hands and say, "Judge, we need a judge to tell us what to do because we got too many claims and not enough money." And so, yeah, I am worried that churches won't want to be associated with an organization in the throes of chaos for 10 years. But I'm also worried there are just enough claims that roll in and we've accepted responsibility for them, and there's not enough money that we then lose control of the decisions we make. There's only a judge at that point has the authority to kind of roll it all up in one ball of wax and say, here's what everybody gets. Here's what's fair for the Baptists to keep. Here's what's fair for the victims to take. And then Baptists lose control, at least for a season, of their important decisions. And that's why, frankly, I think it is good that everybody's decided this responsibility shouldn't be at the executive committee. I think the executive committee takes in the money and distributes it, and they've got a conflict with deciding what victims should get. That'll be hard for them to do the job of protecting the money and giving it away at the same time. So I think independence or at another entity is better than having it at the executive committee. But I do think we need to understand what is it we're being asked to fund, and what does that structure look like, and does it protect our autonomy? If it's necessary, I don't want to hide. Some folks will say, well, this is the mission. It doesn't matter what it takes, what it costs. And that's a fine decision for Baptists to make if they want to make it. But there are real costs to taking that approach. And I just want to make sure we can fulfill the promises we make.
Yeah. Well, look, in wrapping up, let me ask you as an attorney, if you're a messenger and say you've got a few minutes that you can speak to all the messengers before they actually go in and vote on any of these recommendations, or even have debate on the floor about these things, what is the thing or a couple of things that you see as an attorney that you would want them to know, you would want to say to the messengers meeting in Anaheim in this year's convention?
Yeah, well, the most important vote you're going to take is the vote for president, because the president will appoint any implementation committee. And so it's important, I think, that like I said, I would like to see an SBC where the rules apply to everybody the same, and where you don't have one side that gets protected and the other side attacked, where you don't have one side that gets its questions answered and the other side doesn't get its questions answered. That if you're friends of the big wigs, you get things that happen for you, but if you ask tough questions, you're kind of silenced and put to the outside. So I think in the grand scheme of the convention, it's important that your vote for president not be somebody that is associated with the inside, that they have the authority, and they'll be under close scrutiny, believe you me, when they take their actions, and that's good. But you want somebody that is talking about pulling the whole thing out openly and transparently. That's the most important vote you're going to take. On the actual recommendations, I think it's should there be an implementation committee to further consider these things? Probably so. Implementing this particular database, I've not yet heard something that makes me think this is well thought out and also solves a problem.
Right.
Those are my two concerns. Is it biblical and just, and does it solve a problem? So far, I've not seen detailed explanations that would satisfy me yet as a lawyer that that's something I'm excited about. Now, some folks will say we have to build the car while it's rolling downhill, build the engine when we're going down. And that's one approach. My conservative approach has generally been, I want to see it in writing before I agree to it, because I need to know what promises I'm making so that I can tell my church, here's our new job as Baptists. Here's how we respond to each other. So at this point, it'll be interesting to see what recommendations are made. I expect some of the victim advocates to come in and just move to adopt the Guidepost report as written. And I would understand why they would do that. But obviously, we already have some concerns raised by the task force and others about whether that's the best. So floor action will be important. My hesitation, as was said last year, don't vote for anything you don't understand.
Right.
Your most important vote is to vote for a president that will produce a good result for the entire Southern Baptist Convention, that is willing to look not just at the EC, but at NAM and ERLC and IMB. I got friends in all of those places.
Mm-hmm.
I know many of them try to do their best job, but there is a lot of political favoritism in the SBC right now. And I think it's important that the investigations apply across the board, and that the rules we adopt don't just apply to outsiders. I don't want a system where you can be friends with the right people and you can kind of fudge the rules. I want a system where all the Baptists know what's expected of their entities, and from each Baptist church to other Baptist churches. That seems to me like the goal. The goal is strong churches, not Band-Aids on weak churches and weak pastors. And that's what I hope messengers will do when they consider these recommendations.
Yeah, it's a good way to put it. We really don't want a Band-Aid. We need a long-term fix, even though there may be some scarring. We need a long-term fix. I just think about the debate on the messengers or on the convention floor, and I just always think of the scripture, God is not the author of confusion. Right. And you look at that and go, and it stands out because you said, don't vote for something you don't understand.
Right. Right.
And I think,
well,
that is really good advice.
And you don't want to be a surgeon that opens up and finds one tumor and says, well, we got it. Let's sew them back up and send them on their way. Obviously, we found the problem. It was this 25-year-old tumor. I bet you're shot through with tumors. I want a doctor that looks through and says, we got more problems than just this old one. The old one that everyone knew about, let's get rid of that, but let's also ask tough questions. And that'll take a change in the way even conservative Baptists relate to their entities. No one likes to question their hero. And we need a system where we don't cheer our heroes from the stands, but we're all on the same team, keeping each other accountable. And so that means asking our friends hard questions so that we don't have scandals like the Johnny Hunt deal, or like in this report. We don't want scandals that fester for years. We want to stop them in their tracks, and that means changing the system we have and keeping our entities accountable.